They say the first sound he heard was prayer to a god he did not believe in. Not the roar of bolters, not the crack of thunder across a battlefield, but the thin, shaking chant of serfs and scribes and penitents packed shoulder to shoulder inside the fortress of Hera, begging salvation from a marble figure that was never meant to be an idol. In that moment between eternity and breath, when stasis fields flickered and 10,000 years of stillness shuddered like glass about to break, the avenging son opened his eyes and saw that the Imperium his father built had forgotten the difference between a throne and a tomb. This is how Roboute Guilliman returned to a galaxy already lost. For most of those 10 millennia, he did not move. To the people of Ultramar, he was a statue that bled, a miracle that would not finish happening. The stasis field froze the venom in his veins and the breath in his lungs, but it did not erase the wound. The blade that Fulgrim had driven into his throat left a ragged crescent of ruin, forever half-clotted, forever glistening as if the killing stroke had been delivered a heartbeat ago. Pilgrims shuffled past that image, generation after generation, the smell of incense and recycled air thick around them, and told each other that their Lord watched and waited and judged. They did not remember the battle that put him there. Conflicting Dana lived only in redacted librarium vaults and in the scarred nightmares of a handful of immortals. Thessala, the pride of the Emperor wreathed in gunfire, its once perfect halls smeared with the filth of treachery. One brother, his armor once purple and immaculate, now twisted by the touch of Slanesh into something serpentine and obscene, moving with the flexibility of a nightmare. The other, armored in blue and white, bearing a blade and shield forged at his father's side, refusing to step back. The duel tore through bulkheads and through ideals. Fulgrim's laughter echoed from mirrored walls now slick with Astartes' ichor. He moved like music gone wrong, every sweeping cut a perversion of the perfection he once pursued. Guilliman fought like a fortress forced to walk, every blow precise, every guard measured, every retreat calculated. He had spent his existence building structures, empires, systems. On Thessala he tried to build a future with his sword, and found that sometimes a single poisoned strike is enough to topple a continent of plans. The lair blade punched through his gorget in a flash of pale light. Guilliman tasted metal and ash as Fulgrim's gift emptied itself into his throat. Alchemical toxins, warp-tainted venoms, microscopic demons laughing as they burrowed. He swung once more out of instinct and rage, and left a crack in his brother's armor that would never quite close. It was not enough. Muscles failed, vision narrowed. The Primarch of the 13th Legion, architect of Ultramar, author of the Codex Astartes, dropped to one knee as his sons roared and dragged him from the field. Did what a war master's fleets could not. It killed the future by freezing it. Salvador Donget, the apothecaries and magi tried everything. Gene purges, psychic excisions, machine-assisted miracles. His body fought. His biology was built to adapt, regenerate, endure. But the venom laced itself through every system. Remove it, and the tissue it clung to died. Leave it, and it continued its slow, patient work. The choice was not between life and death, but between death now or death later. They chose something else. Stasis fields had preserved relics and weapons and entire battle barges before, never a Primarch. The fortress of Hera's deepest vault was cleared, warded,
sanctified. Machines older than most hive worlds hummed as adepts recalibrated them to hold not steel, but flesh. Guilliman was seated upon a throne of marble veined with adamantium, cables and umbilicals sinking into his spine,
the glow of the field wrapping him in frozen light. The wound at his throat still bled when they activated it. It never stopped. The pilgrim to see him like that was a serf who had once scrubbed his armor. He knelt because he did not know what else to do. Instances followed because they saw him kneel. Within a century, the Temple of Correction had become something the Primarch would never have built: a shrine. At Fed, the Ultramarines resisted the language of sainthood. Their lord had written laws, not litanies. He had codified tactics, not miracles. But the Imperium does not tolerate empty spaces. The ecclesiarchy crept in, bearing relics and hymns. Administratum clerks built tithe schedules around pilgrimage flows. Chapter serfs sold icons in shadowed cloisters. Guilliman, wrapped in his own last heartbeat, could not stop any of it. Outside the realm he had created twisted into something his past self might have admired from a distance and condemned up close. Ultramar became an empire within an empire, a cluster of worlds that functioned better than they had any right to in a galaxy this diseased. Crops grew, factories met quotas, administrators remembered that their purpose was service, not indulgence, at least more often than elsewhere. The Codex Astartes, written as a set of guidelines to prevent another concentration of power like Horus's legion, hardened in his absence into scripture. Lines he had framed as should turned into must. Tactical flexibility ossified into ritual. Space Marine chapters across the Imperium quoted him without reading him. They invoked his name when hemming themselves in with rules he had intended to be broken when necessary. The Inquisition used his passages on discipline to justify purges of non-compliant chapters, whose only sin was improvisation. In the ecclesiarchy's more questionable texts, he appeared as an unwitting prophet who had written doctrine he never intended as religious law. Guilliman's frozen eyes watched over it all, unblinking. Some say he dreamed. Librarians stationed in the temple reported psychic anomalies, flickers of thought that did not come from any mind in the room, shadows of strategy maps, the taste of ash and oil. Night after night, a few would wake screaming from visions of the galaxy splitting along a jagged wound of light, entire sectors drowning in screaming warp fire. The records were catalogued, stamped with the sigil of anomalous devotional phenomena, and filed away in vaults that no one read unless they were already afraid of what they might find. Negligence marched centuries marched on. His sons died and were replaced. Names on the chapter's honor rolls lengthened into scrolls that needed servo skulls to carry them. Wars came and went, tyrannic incursions smashing against Ultramar's borders, orc wogs clawing at its edges, chaos raids probing for weakness. Each crisis ended the same way, with the people of Ultramar filing past a motionless figure, whispering for aid, and commanders in the next chamber over pinning new battle honors on banners that his hand had never raised. Boca War away, Cadia burned. The 13th Black Crusade did what 12 could not. The pylons shattered, the sky tore, the cicatrix maledictum ripped the galaxy in half, and suddenly night had a name that could be plotted on a star chart. Half the Imperium vanished into the kind of darkness that eats astropathic songs and leaves only static. The other half blinked in the failing light of the Astronomicon,
and tried to pretend that this, too, was survivable. Only then did the old promises come crawling out of their hiding places. Them Belisarius' call had been busy. The Archmagos Dominus had not slept in longer than most civilizations last. He had been given orders long before the heresy reached Terra's walls, when the Emperor still walked, and Guilliman still believed that the Great Crusade was a road, not a dead end.
Create better warriors. Safeguard the future. Prepare contingencies. Those were the words, writ in noospheric sigils and gene-coded whispers. Call took them literally and without limit. Graves Friday. He took legions worth of gene seed, samples from all Primarch lines he could legally obtain, and a few he could not. He dissected old Mars tech, scavenged Dark Age designs from crash sites and buried vaults, bartered secrets from Forge worlds that would have screamed heresy if they knew what else lay in his databanks. He built new organs for Astartes' bodies, bypass circuits when old enhancements reached their limits, reinforced bone and mind and soul in ways that pushed the boundary between innovation and abomination. The Primaris were his test. The armor of fate was his masterpiece. It was unlike anything current Mars doctrine approved. Its power feeds curled not just around a fusion core, but through systems whose design runes did not match any known Mechanicus pattern. Its plate could interface with stasis fields and life support thrones. Its inner workings were sealed behind encryption levels keyed to two names only: Call and Guilliman. Among the tech priests who whispered about it in Ben Harik when their superiors were offline, rumors coiled that fragments of alien technology rested in its frame, that it had been designed to bridge a gap between one moment and the next 10,000 years later. Even the mightiest warplate needs a spark. It came from a source most of the Imperium would have preferred to kill on sight. The Eldari had been dying since before humanity learned to stand upright. Their slow-motion extinction had many names, most of them spoken in that keening language that no human vox could render. The newest of their desperate answers was Ennead, the god of the dead not yet born, and the Inari who followed him. Ivrain, emissary of that strange faith, carried a fragment of their hope like a blade. She walked into the fortress of Hera under a storm of disapproval. To Ultramarines, whose earliest legends spoke of Eldar raiders and treacherous Xenos, her presence was an insult draped in soulstones and wraithbone. To the Ecclesiarchy's representatives, it was blasphemy dressed as necessity. To Call, it was a variable in an equation he had been waiting 10,000 years to solve. Around Guilliman's frozen throne, machine altars hummed. Stasis projectors cycled down in precise increments, bringing a fraction of time back into the room. The armor of fate stood on its own plinth, cables trailing from it like veins waiting for a heart. Servo skulls bobbed, incense burned, prayers and Ben Harik cants overlapped like static. Ivrain stepped into the field. Her power was not the warp sorcery of human witches, clumsy and dangerous. It was a more deliberate murder of the veil, a scalpel instead of a club. The crone sword in her hand drank in the residual energies around Guilliman's wound, its edge tracing the invisible thread of Fulgrim's venom where it coiled through his arteries, lungs, hearts. Where chaos had left its hooks, Ennead's shadow pried them loose. For those watching outside the shimmering distortion of the stasis field, it was a flicker. One heartbeat he was a statue. The next, His fingers spasmed. The first breath was not noble. It was a ragged, animal drag of air through a throat that remembered being cut. Stasis had frozen the poison in place, but left his nerves aware enough to remember what dying felt like. 10,000 years of that moment hit him at once. His back arched against restraints that had not been designed for struggle. Servo arms snapped. Augmetic clamps screamed as his muscles surged awake. The second breath was a roar. It shook dust from vault ceilings that had not been disturbed since before the age of apostasy. It turned litanies into stutters and knocked weaker men to their knees. For an instant, everyone in the chamber believed that if he rose unarmored and walked out of the temple in that moment, guillotine in hand, he could carve the great rift out of the sky by force of will alone. Reality reasserted itself with a cough of blood onto the stasis throne's steps. Call moved with the urgency of someone both terrified and vindicated. Tubes detached from obsolete ports, reconnecting to the armor of fate. Medicae refitted old interface sockets, realigning them with new organs that had grown imperfectly in stasis, never tested. Ivrain stepped back, exhausted, her work done. The rest would be mortal labor. The next time Guilliman opened his eyes, he was inside the armor that would keep him alive. It felt wrong. A Primarch's body is a known quantity to its owner. For centuries he had inhabited the same frame, altered only by scars and experience. Now there were foreign weights under his ribs, new rhythms in his hearts, machine hums where once there was only the steady pulse of gene-forged muscle. The venom was gone, but its absence ached. Painkillers and combat stims chased each other through his bloodstream. System readouts whispered across his vision. Every movement woke a choir of warning runes and status sigils. Whitey ignored all of it and demanded information. To the moment was miraculous. Their gene sire, their living myth, speaking with a voice no longer filtered through shrines and statues. They tried to greet him with titles refined over centuries of worship. He cut through them like smoke. What is the state of Ultramar? What is the state of the Imperium? What has become of my father's work? The answers were a slow-motion execution. Data slates piled up. Holoprojectors traced the borders of an empire that called itself galactic and yet was rotting from within. The High Lord's decrees overlaid with the Inquisition's death warrants, the ecclesiarchy's monuments layered over starving hive districts.
Reports from Cadia that ended mid-sentence. Astropathic charts showing where the Astronomican's beam had been steady and where it now flickered or did not reach at all. Of Vandire's tyranny and the brides of the Emperor marching through blood. He read of the ecclesiarchs who followed, of faith weaponized and then sanctified. He saw how a simple prohibition against sorcery had metastasized into a hatred of psychers so blind that humanity strangled its own potential out of fear of chaos. He watched centuries of persecution cascade through inquisitorial records that measured success in worlds burned. He saw that the Codex Astartes had become the chains he had written it to break. Chapters sanctioned for deviation that he would have called common sense. Crusades launched not against Xenos empires, but against fellow humans whose sin was worshipping the Emperor's image with the wrong words. Successor chapters of his own gene line locked in petty rivalries, while tyrannid hive fleets devoured sectors and orc empires grew fat on neglected borders.
Somewhere between the record of the Second Tyrannic War and the Third, he closed his eyes. Not to pray, to think. The armor of fate monitored his vitals and flagged the spike in stress responses as an anomaly. The Medicae servitors standing sentry reached for more sedatives. He waved them away. Pain was a better anchor than the disorientation that lurked behind it. In 10,000 years of frozen not death, his mind had been a trapped thing, chewing on the last problems he remembered. Now those equations had been replaced by a single, impossible sum. What do you save when everything is broken? Ultramar spun on. Rumors spread faster than any official proclamation. The Primarch lives. The statue moves. The Lord of Macragge walks. Some dismissed it as heresy, a Xenos trick, a test of faith.
Others believed instantly, because belief was the only power they had ever been allowed to wield. On farm worlds, entire villages dropped to their knees facing the sky, begging for his gaze. In Manufactoria, workers dared to look up from their quotas and whisper that perhaps the tithe pressures might ease. In the chapter's own halls, things were less simple. Calgar had led the Ultramarines longer than most civilizations had lasted. His name was carved into as many honors as some Primarchs. Now he stood before his Gene-Father and felt, for a fleeting shameful moment, like a neophyte again. Guilliman saw the awe in his eyes, heard the almost prayer in his first words, and stopped it with a sentence that would come to define his new existence. I am no god. It was not a rebuke of Calgar's reverence alone. It was an attempt to claw back some part of reality from the edifice of myth that had been built around him. In the reactions that followed, the relief in some faces, the offense in others, the wary calculation in a few inquisitorial observers, he saw exactly how far the Imperium had drifted. Once, a Primarch's statement about his own nature would have been accepted as fact. Now it was a theological position to be debated. The first days of his resurrection were a blur of councils, fluttermasters and PDF generals, rogue traders and planetary governors, all summoned or arrived uninvited, eager to pledge allegiance, demand guidance, offer excuses. Guilliman listened to each. He drew maps upon maps, tracing supply lines that no longer existed, fleets that had been lost without record, worlds that paid tithes to administratum offices that did not realize their populations had been dead for centuries. Paused, he called for call. The Archmagos arrived, trailed by servitors and Scutari, cogitator banks hissing. He presented the Primaris like an artisan unveiling a prototype. Taller, stronger, more resilient. New implants, upgraded armor patterns. Astartes 2.0, if one were inclined toward profane simplicity. Guilliman saw the tactical value at a glance. He also saw the implications. You changed my father's design, he told Call privately. You took the most sacred pattern in the Imperium and rewrote it without oversight. Call replied with the kind of logic that had been both his making and his damnation. Someone had to. The argument did not resolve. It folded into a compromise born of necessity. The galaxy was in flames. Guilliman could not afford to throw away legions of warriors because their existence offended old principles. The Codex Astartes bent, ever so slightly, under the weight of reality. His thoughts did not stay in Ultramar for long. The Great Rift had cut the Imperium in half. Cadia's pyre still glowed in his mind from the archival Pict feeds. Somewhere beyond that wound, the despoiler was still out there. Somewhere on Terra,
The Golden Throne ate 1,000 psyker souls a day just to keep the Emperor's corpse from failing. If Ultramar was to be more than a well-managed graveyard, he had to move. The voyage to Terra would have been hard in a sane age. In the age of the Rift, it was a calculated blasphemy against probability. Fleets always risked the warp. Now they risked something worse, its absence. In the shadow of the cicatrix, routes flickered in and out of existence. Warp currents that had been stable for millennia collapsed into riptides or flat dead zones. Demon incursions bled through at angles no navigator had charts for. Guilliman knew all this. He read the casualty projections. He launched anyway. The McCragg's honor became the spearhead of a hastily assembled armada. Ultramarines, strike cruisers, Imperial Navy battleships, Mechanicus Arc Mechanicum platforms, pilgrim vessels pressed into service as troop transports. Primaris contingents filled berthing decks that had never been meant to hold that many giants.
McCragg's orbital yards burned day and night, feeding munitions and repair materials into ships that would probably never make it back. There was no ceremony when the fleet translated. One moment there was a starfield, the next a smear of unreality. Guilliman stood on the bridge, armor locked to the deck, as alarms howled and Geller fields flared. The warp pressed against the hull like a sea of teeth. On its surface, shapes moved, half-remembered battles replaying in ghostly miniature, faces of dead brothers stretched into mockeries by demonic hands, fractal repetitions of his own duel with Fulgrim spiraling into infinity. Once, a Primarch could walk the edge of the Imperium's madness and remain untouched. Now, even he felt its hunger. The fleet lurched through ambushes that never quite manifested, phantom minefields of thought and fear. Translating out into real space became an act of exorcism. Sometimes they emerged to find a system where their charts said emptiness should be. Sometimes there was only debris where a world had once orbited. Sometimes there were human signals, warped and broken, begging for aid in dialects that had not been spoken since before the heresy. In one nameless system, they dropped into the path of a Black Legion striking force. What followed was not a battle fit for legends. It was a chore. Ships maneuvered, guns fired, boarders launched. Guilliman joined one of those actions because it was easier than staying on the bridge and listening to casualty reports. The demon engine he killed on that rusting deck, its flesh-iron hide inscribed with mockeries of his own heraldry, was just one more abomination in a galaxy full of them. The Chaos Lord who died choking on the Emperor's sword was just one more echo of Horus. None of it changed the fact that for every enemy fleet he burned, a dozen others were tearing at the Imperium elsewhere. After each skirmish, more ships were left behind, crippled or too slow.
The armada shrank. The distance to Terra did not.
Welcome the rare quiet between alarms. Guilliman sat alone in a strategium that had once held his brother's holographic images, and now held only scatterings of astropathic static. The armor of fate whispered diagnostics across his skin. The great rift split the galaxy map in two, a ragged black wound that no amount of tactical genius could close. Somewhere beyond it, whole sectors had slipped into a night from which no answer came. He thought of the statue in the Temple of Correction, and understood, with a clarity that hurt, why his people had turned him into a saint. When the fleet finally broke into Saw, it did so bleeding. Systems defenses did not recognize them immediately. In an age where demons walked behind Imperial hulls and traitor chapters still flew colors stolen from the loyal, suspicion was default. Warnings blared from Saturnine bastions. Mars noospheres flared with challenge codes. It took long minutes and a signal from the Sigillite's old seals, reactivated by desperate savants on Terra before the guns turned away. Guilliman's first sight of the throne world in 10,000 years was a world he barely knew. Clouds brown with pollution, hive spires taller than any he remembered, their tops wreathed in constant lightning. Pilgrim fleets forming a ring of rusting devotion around the planet, their holds packed with bodies who would never see the surface. The palace's outer walls had grown, layers upon layers of fortification accreted like barnacles around the original structures he had helped plan. Vox traffic was a constant scream. The Astronomican's light, once a steady spear into the warp, now flickered at the edges of his senses like a candle in a gale. He did not step onto Terra as a son returning home. He stepped onto it as a commander walking onto a battlefield he already knew was lost and refused to abandon anyway. The audience with the Emperor would come. Imbellimitous crusade would rise from its outcome. The slow suffocation of governance would begin. But that belongs to the next movement of this dirge. For now, in the echoing galleries of the Imperial Palace, as dust from 1,000 dead ages drifted down onto armor that had not walked these halls since before the heresy, Roboute Guilliman felt the weight of a universe's expectations settle on his shoulders, and understood that resurrection was not a mercy. It was a sentence. The first thing the palace did was try to swallow him. Not with teeth or blades, but with memory misaligned. He walked through halls whose dimensions he knew in his bones, and found them changed by the sediment of 10,000 years. Corridors that had once been clean lines of ceramite and gold were now choked with extra bulkheads, new shrines grafted onto old walls, defensive layers built on top of defensive layers until the original architecture was buried like fossil bone. Where once regiments had paraded, there were now rivers of pilgrims, their clothes threadbare, their eyes hollow with hunger and awe. Servo skulls floated above them like mechanical carrion, recording every gesture of devotion. Custodians watched him from shadowed alcoves, their auramite plate the same as it had been on the day Horus died, and yet older, weightier, the patina of centuries clinging to every engraved sigil. For some, this was the first time they had seen him in the flesh. For a handful, it was a reunion delayed beyond reason. None of them spoke unless he addressed them directly. The silence was a constant presence, thick as the recycled air. He moved deeper, toward a door that was never meant to be opened often. Every sanctum imperialis loomed ahead like a wound in the palace's heart. Once, it had been the strategic nerve center of an empire in motion. Now, it was a temple, a prison, a machine hall whose function no mortal mind fully understood.
The Golden Throne's macrostructure had grown, buttressed by mechanicus constructions that crawled like tumorous metal over the bones of the original design. Cables thicker than starship hulls vanished into walls. Plasma conduits glowed with a sickly light. The air tasted of ozone and old blood. The closer he came, the more the warp itself seemed to thin. Sisters of silence lined the approach, their blank presence cutting off the psychic background noise that he had never realized he had grown used to. Around them, the warp was a muffled thing. That absence was its own kind of pressure. It stripped away the distractions until there was only his own mind, his own doubts, and the knowledge of what sat on the throne ahead.
There were others waiting. High lords in robes heavy with authority and fear. Inquisitors with rosettes that meant less in this room than anywhere else in the galaxy. Mechanicus magi whose eyes were lenses and whose hearts were reactors. They were all ostensibly his peers now, yet every one of them looked at the door to the inner sanctum with the same uneasy mixture of reverence and dread. When it opened, there was no trumpeted fanfare, only a rush of air, as if the chamber beyond had been holding its breath. The throne was not a chair. It longitude of machinery, a mountain of gold and iron and suffering. The emperor's body sat at its heart, what remained of it. Flesh had withered away where it was not replaced with hardware. Bone was hidden beneath armor and tubing and relic plate engraved with 1,000 overlapping litanies. His face, what little could be seen of it, was a skull wreathed in light, its eye sockets burning with a radiance that was not entirely physical. Guilliman remembered a tall figure in Baroque armor, a man who smiled rarely but with real warmth, who spoke quietly and expected the galaxy to rearrange itself to match his plans. He remembered a father. This was something else.
The psychic impact of that gaze was not an attack. It was too vast and too constant for that. It was like walking under a star and suddenly being aware of every photon it had ever emitted. Voices, images, concepts without names hammered at him in a flood that would have obliterated any lesser mind. Fragments of battles, centuries past, calculations of astropathic linkages spanning the entire segmentum, the screams of 1,000 psychers dying on the black ships in this very moment, all of it layered and compressed into a single, searing impression. In that torrent, he felt something like recognition. Not warmth, not love, not as humans understand it, not fact for the psychobitted. Not warmth, not understand it, if it was some way that people take, not a deculist for them. Not love, but not it was be able to it. Not warmth, not evadition. That torrent, he felt something like recognition. Not warmth, not as humans understand it. Not warmth, not as humans understand it. In that torrent, he felt something like recognition. In that torrent, he felt something like recognition. That blaming, not as humans understand it. A cold acknowledgement. A recalculation in a machine mind that had been doing nothing but recalculate for 10,000 years. He had prepared, burned away before he could speak them. The Emperor did not answer them in words. Instead, understanding slammed into him in blocks like tablets of fire. The weakening of the Astronomicon. The strain on the Golden Throne's ancient circuitry. The rising pressure of the warp across the galaxy. The fragmenting of Imperial authority as worlds were cut off from Terra's light. Threats plotted not on flat maps, but in 4 dimensions, time and probability and faith and fear. There were orders, strategies, imperatives. There were no reassurances. For a staggering instant, Guilliman saw the Imperium as his father saw it. Not as a nation to be governed, but as a perpetually burning equation to be balanced with blood and belief. The weight of it was such that his knees hit the floor, armor and all. When the contact snapped, the silence was deafening. He found himself gasping like a diver dragged from the depths, his fingers dug into the throne's steps.
Custodians had moved without him seeing, ready to cut him down if he had reacted badly. Sisters' null auras smothered the lingering psychic echoes.
High Lords watched with expressions carefully composed, as if this was a thing they saw every day. Perhaps some of them did. He rose. Whatever he had hoped to find here, it was not comfort. The being on the throne was still the Emperor, in some sense that mattered to the warp and to reality itself. But the man he had called father was gone, dissolved into the machinery of survival. If there was approval in that burning gaze, it was the approval a craftsman gives a tool that still functions after being left in the rain. A title waited for him in the outer hall, offered by lips that had practiced the words long before they were spoken. Lord Commander of the Imperium, Regent of Terra, Voice of the Emperor. They sounded like shackles. He accepted them anyway. It was either that, or watch the edifice collapse under its own contradictions, and he had never been one to let a structure fall while there was still a way, any way, to brace it. From that day his battles were fought on two fronts, with fleets and legions, in the echoing chambers of imperial bureaucracy, with words and signatures and the slow, grinding resistance of institutions that had outlived the reasons they were created. Safest crusade was the obvious war. It had the clarity of motion, at least. Ships could be pointed toward objectives, fleets could be marshaled, orders could be written that turned into materiel and march orders and casualty lists. There was satisfaction in that, brutal and incomplete though it was. He broke the effort into fleets not because 10 was a sacred number, but because any more would have shattered control and any fewer would have been too easy a target. He appointed admiration and chapter masters as spearheads, bound them with oaths that referenced the codex, but widened it where it had become a straitjacket. He authorized calls primaris to be divided and delivered like a genetic firestorm, shoring up failing chapters, resurrecting dying ones, creating entirely new formations to plug the holes left by 10,000 years of attrition. Ray's ceremony was the same. Priests screaming blessings loud enough to be heard over the thunder of engines. Banners heavy with centuries of honors snapping in the launch bay gales. Champion Marines raising blades and promising to bring back victory, or not return at all. Every one of those fleets would vanish into warp storms that could tear them apart without the enemy firing a shot. Guilliman watched them go from a stratagem that never slept and felt something like theft. He was stealing futures from the men and women who followed him. Simulated the victories that came back in astropathic fragments were never clean. A forge world pulled back from the brink of demon incursion at the cost of its entire mortal population, its surface now a sterile plain of cooling slag that could be re-industrialized but never lived upon. A shrine world saved from a chaos cult only for its people to turn on their liberators, maddened beyond recovery by years of concentrated fanaticism. A hive retaken from tyrannids only after its lower levels had been purged with viral fire, leaving the survivors to tunnel through the corpses of their own species in search of light. Sometimes the reports contained names that meant nothing to anyone outside a single system. A governor who held on too long. A PDF colonel who refused to break when the rest of his command staff fled. A sister hospitaler who kept a hospital running in a city where the sky rained spores. Guilliman read those names as carefully as he read the movements of tyrannid tendrils and orc wogs, and hated that he could not do more than write commendations into ledgers that the galaxy would never see. He earned his own scars.
Worlds that would never make it into the official epics felt the weight of his tread.
There was a moon in the Ghoul stars where the ground itself was saturated with warp residue from some long-ago atrocity, every step kicking up glimmers of memory that tried to crawl into the minds of the living. He fought there alongside a chapter whose heraldry he had never seen before that day and would never see again. The enemy were things that had once been human, then demonic, then something between. He cut them down, led a retreat that was technically a victory, and left the moon burning, its atmosphere peeled off in a single, surgical bombardment. There was a fortress station dangling in the edge of the pariah nexus, where psychers died without making a sound, their connection to the warp sliced away as neatly as a surgeon's cut. Necron constructs marched through its hollowed decks with mechanical disdain, dismantling Imperial architecture as if tidying someone else's mess. Guilliman joined a counterboarding action there, his blows shattering living metal that reformed almost as fast as it was destroyed. The station was eventually reclaimed, at least on paper. Months later, the records quietly marked it as quarantined, its population subject to observation for anomalies no one wanted to define. The crusade burned through the galaxy like a torch waved through a storm. Where it passed, some islands of relative stability were created. Routes were opened, worlds cut off since the rift's birth saw Imperial banners again. But the storm did not abate. Behind each fleet, the warp frothed and closed, swallowing some of the paths they had used. New threats rose in the voids they had cleared. Chaos did not sit still. Neither did the Xenos. There were moments of genuine, almost old-fashioned triumph. The relief of a besieged chapter monastery whose defenders had been down to their last clip of bolt ammunition. The annihilation of a Black Legion spearhead that had thought to ambush Fleet Primus and found itself flanked by reinforcements Guilliman had dispatched weeks before, based on probabilities that now paid off. The destruction of a corrupted Titan Legio, when a loyal engine princeps walked his wounded god machine into the heart of the enemy formation and detonated its core by choice. But the ledger did not balance. For every victory, there were 3 worlds the crusade did not reach in time. For every chapter saved, there was one that was only a name on a list marked Status Unknown or Presumed Lost. The Imperium had become too big to save and too interconnected to abandon any part of without risking the collapse of the whole. When the formal end of the crusade was declared, more an administrative marking of a phase than any real conclusion, Guilliman did not feel victorious. He felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with battle fatigue. The war with the warp and with the Xenos would never end. That was a truth he had accepted even before the heresy. What weighed on him now was different. It was the knowledge that the other war, the one within the machinery of the Imperium itself, means the one that finally killed it. As Lord Commander, he had an office. It was a joke, that word, for a complex of rooms the size of a minor city's central administration, staffed by scribes and remembrancers and cogitator banks whose sole purpose was to try to keep track of the rivers of paper and data that flowed through his hands. He spent more hours there than on any battlefield. It left fewer visible scars and more lasting damage. Psychologists did not oppose him openly, intelligent and too afraid for that. Instead, they clung. Every reform he proposed had to be prized through their fingers, line by line. Reducing redundant tithe demands that were killing resource worlds resulted in months of debate over the proper form of the new requisition scrolls.
Attempting to remove obviously corrupt officials sparked investigations that spiraled into witch hunts until he personally intervened. Efforts to standardize void ship construction ran aground on forge worlds that treated their STC fragments as sacred relics to be hoarded, not shared. The ecclesiarchy was worse. He tried, at first, to thread the needle. He had no desire to provoke another age of apostasy. He knew the power faith held in the hearts of ordinary citizens. He had seen armies stand their ground against demonic nightmares because they believed the Emperor watched them. But he could not ignore how that same faith had been twisted into a weapon against reason and against the very reforms that might have saved billions. When he ordered certain more egregious excesses curtailed, worlds being required to send their entire surplus population to Terra as untrained pilgrims, shrines built with resources that nearby hives needed to keep their air scrubbers running, he found himself labeled a heretic by whispers in corner chapels. Artists began to paint him with a halo he did not want. Cults sprang up that worshipped not the Emperor, but the Regent. He shut them down with the same ruthlessness he would have once reserved for chaos sects. The irony did not comfort him. Manipulating meetings felt increasingly like campaigns fought in slow motion. He learned to read the tiny shifts of expression on faces that had grown expert at revealing nothing. A raised eyebrow from a novice Nobilite matriarch when warp travel regulations were discussed. The way an inquisitor's hand twitched toward their rosette at the mention of cooperation with Xenos. He spent late nights, if such words meant anything on a world where the sky was perpetual,
Artificial twilight, in a private chamber with only a few surviving maps from before the heresy on the walls. There, for a few hours at a time, he allowed himself to remember what the galaxy had once looked like to him. A canvas of potential, not a catalogue of crises. Then he turned back to the present, picked up the stylus, and signed more death warrants disguised as necessary orders. He tried to write a new book. Parma Codex for War, but a charter for survival. Draft after draft was scrapped. One version was too idealistic, assuming a level of good faith from institutions that had long since forgotten the concept. Another was too brutal, codifying sacrifices he could not bring himself to enshrine, even though he knew, in his more honest moments, that they would probably be made anyway. In the end, what emerged was a patchwork of policy adjustments and long-term plans that might, if nothing else, keep the worst of the rot from reaching the core too quickly. Outside the walls of Terra, the universe continued to obey none of his timetables. Kelly, the Necrons woke in greater numbers, their tomb worlds rising like knives beneath Imperial feet. The Silent King moved pieces in a game whose board stretched back to before humanity's first fire. Tyrannid hive fleets shifted and merged, learning, adapting, probing at the edges of Ultramar again with a hunger that had no concept of fear. Chaos surged and ebbed, its champions falling and being replaced as easily as a mortal might change masks. And then there were the orcs. They were not subtle. He did not twist the warp with sinister rituals or use infiltrators to subvert administratum chains. They did not write apocrypha or dispute charters. They explained their position in shells and industrial-scale decapitations. In a galaxy of nuanced horrors, their simplicity was almost an insult. From his strategium,
Guilliman watched green tides roll across sectors that had been reduced to numbers on parchment for most of the High Lords. To patterns. He had fought orcs during the Great Crusade, when the Imperium was young and the galaxy seemed full of frontier wars and challenges to be overcome with clever logistics and superior firepower. The Greenskins had been a problem even then, a constant, breeding, brutal fact that could be pushed back but never eradicated. 10,000 years later, they were still there, bigger, louder, as unaffected by the warp storm that tore the galaxy in half as if it were a minor inconvenience. Reports crossed his desk about worlds planets stripped of soil by stomping gargants, hive worlds turned into open-air arenas of endless slaughter, forge worlds besieged not because the orcs needed their products, but because they enjoyed the noise. Worlds name did not blur. Architects. Armageddon. It had burned itself into the Imperium's collective memory long before he returned. A furnace world whose skies had been ash-gray before the first orc ever descended into its atmosphere, whose hives scraped at a sun they could not see through the industrial smog. It had been a battleground more times than most citizens had drawn breath. Orcs loved it. The Imperium could not afford to lose it. He read the records of the First War. Angron's invasion, the demon Primarch carving a path through guardsmen whose courage meant nothing against his rage, the Grey Knights and the Inquisition doing what had to be done afterward to prevent contamination spreading, killing the survivors, wiping the memories, sanitizing the truth. He read of the Second and the Third, Gazgul Mac Uruk Thraka's wogs tearing into the planet's crust like spears, the arrival of Commissar Yarrick, the stand at Hell's Reach, Titans striding through slag seas.
Space Marines from a dozen chapters spilling blood in the same ruined streets that had already known too much of it. Orc banners rising, falling, rising again. Imperial command arguing about reinforcement allocations as if the planet were a piece on a board, while millions died in mud that had once been human. Files thickened as the wars went on, not with clarity, but with contradictions. Official histories talkatorial addenda spoke of necessary purges, regiments mind-scrubbed, populations relocated, exterminatus authorized for neighboring systems that might have been tainted by proximity to demonic entities or orc spores. Mechanicus reports tracked the damage to refineries and the cost of replacing pipework on a planetary scale. Ecclesiarchal documents cataloged miracles, visions, saintly intercessions amid artillery barrages. Very few of those texts, Guilliman noticed, talked about what it meant that the orcs kept coming back. Arm was not unique because it had been attacked. It was unique because it made the lie that the Imperium liked to tell itself, that wars were fought, won, and then filed away as victories, impossible to maintain. On most worlds, once the banners were raised and the dead counted, the narrative could move on. Here, the same enemy returned, the same hives burned again, the same rivers ran green with pollutants and red with blood. Children grew up playing in the ruins of battles their grandparents had barely survived, only to reach adulthood in time to be drafted into the next defense. Every orc killed dropped spores that ensured more orcs would rise. Every imperial victory was a temporary reprieve carved out of the momentum of a species that did not understand the concept of defeat. Guilliman knew the strategic importance of the place. Armageddon's forges fed entire sectors. Its position anchored supply lines that could not easily be rerouted. Its loss would cascade catastrophically through already strained logistics. On a map, holding it made sense. On a human level, he was not sure the word sense applied to anything about it. Parcel. Had the luxury to go there himself. There were too many other fires to contain. Tyrannid tendrils chewing at Ultramar's edges again,
Necron awakenings in the Pariah Nexus, chaos cults turning hive after hive into internal sinkholes. But the world kept appearing in his briefings, a recurrence he could not ignore. Each time it did, the numbers were worse. Casualty estimates rose. Reconstruction times lengthened. Warnings from the Ordo Xenos about the adaptation of orc tactics and war gear grew more urgent. He authorized reinforcements. He signed off on more regiments being raised, more chapters committing companies to the defense. He approved Mechanicus requests to test new weaponry there, because where else could you guarantee such an abundance of targets and such a low likelihood that any collateral damage would actually make things worse? Between other crises, when exhaustion blurred the edges of his vision and the armor of fate's life support hum was the only constant, he would find himself staring at a lonely notation in the endless data stream. Armageddon, contested. In that one word was encapsulated the entire reality of the Imperium he now led. Not victorious, not lost, not secure. Ronde-dested. Blankets. Always. It was the same for the galaxy at large, for Ultramar, for Terra, for every hive and shrine and forge world. Nothing was safe. Nothing was truly saved. Everything was in a state of being fought over, slowly, desperately, at an ever-rising cost. Did not despair because the enemy was strong. He despaired because his own side had made a religion of never admitting how weak they had become. In moments of brutal honesty, the kind that he allowed himself only in private,
and never committed fully to record, he admitted something else, too. The orcs understood this age better than humans did. They pretend that their wars would end. They did not dress slaughter up in legal codes and administratum stamps. They did not carve statues and write edicts insisting that this campaign, this crusade, this push would change everything. For them, battle was the point. The endless return to the fight was not a tragedy, but fulfillment. The Imperium bled itself dry, insisting that every war was for peace. Armageddon stood as proof that this was a lie. The orcs roared it from every rusted gun barrel and every scrap metal banner. In the quiet between summons, looking at the hollow projection of that world and the tide of green that forever battered it, Guilliman found his resolve not in hope of victory, but in the acceptance of something colder. Their Miriam would not be saved in the way he had once imagined. It would not be cured of its corruption or lifted into some new golden age. At best, it would endure. A wounded beast that managed to keep its feet long enough that something worse did not replace it. The work he did, the crusades he launched, the reforms he forced through, were not steps toward glory. They were the act of holding a line that could never be allowed to fall, even if the ground under it was a graveyard. He kept signing orders. He kept sending fleets. He reading the casualty reports from places like Armageddon. And he kept doing everything in his power to ensure that, when the greenskins came screaming out of the void yet again, there would still be humans there to meet them. Because in the end, in the far future that has no dawn, the fate of the Imperium will not be decided in council chambers or on parchment, but in the ruin-choked streets of worlds like that, of battlefield of furnace stacks and hive slums, under a sky blackened by promethium smoke and spores, where orc war engines bellow
and guardsmen cough up blood as they fix bayonets for one more charge. Humanity's empire will show its true face, stripped of all titles and pretense. And if there is any justice left in a universe that has forgotten the word, the last verdict on Roboute Guilliman's desperate labor will not be written by quills on Terra, but hammered out in bolter fire and chain-blade teeth over Armageddon, in the unending roar where the Imperium's lie of victory is drowned forever by the only truth the orcs have ever needed, that the war never ends. And Armageddon belongs to those still standing in the killing fields when the smoke fails to clear, and the orcs come howling again.